Andy Birch at andybirch.com, presenting tonight on Nocturnal Flight Calls. And next week, there we are, Exotic Dilemmas and Gross Domestic Products. And okay, now I think we're done. Let me stop the share. And with that, I think I would like to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Susan?
Okay, thank you, Ron. Well, it's our pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Andy Birch. Andy has been birding in Los Angeles County for 25 years, and he can often be found birding Griffith Park and the LA River around Glendale and Los Feliz. Andy is a well-known illustrator of birds, and over the last 30 years, Andy has illustrated identification plates for field guides and created brilliant illustrations for the front covers of major birding magazines in North America and Europe. And you can see some of Andy's work. Well, here on the screen, he did that bell sparrow for us, for Los Angeles birders, and also at his website, which Ron had listed on the screen a moment ago. It's www.andybirch.com. Andy has also written several articles on challenging bird identification, including dowitchers, loons, immature orioles, pipits, peewees, and he's currently working on a book on Epidionax identification. We're pleased to have Andy as a valued member of the Los Angeles Birders Board of Directors. But tonight, Andy is going to help us understand bird migration as it happens at night. So turn down the lights, learn how to witness and record this hidden bird migration happening across our skies at night. So without further ado, please welcome Andy Birch.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to start tonight, with a little night music. It's a nightscape of a busy, noisy Los Angeles last April. In this clip, you hear a lot of our familiar city sounds: train horns from the depot a couple of miles away, sirens along Los Feliz Boulevard, people talking on the street below, and that low, ever-present rumbling white noise of city traffic as cars rush along the not so distant I-5 freeway, which, as many people know, is one of our busiest freeways in our city. But if you listen very carefully, above all this urban noise, you'll also hear some thin seeps and peeps and other strange, but perhaps familiar to us birders, faint noises. So these are coming from birds migrating overhead. I also want to note that what we're seeing here is a spectrogram. So we can actually literally see these otherwise invisible to us night migrants. See if you can actually spot the human noises and the bird calls on this spectrogram. There'll be a visual cue about a second before each call, so you can prepare, and hopefully you'll be able to hear most or all of them. And you may want to just crank up the volume on your computer as well. So if I told you that in the spring and fall of 2020, my yard had solitary and spotted sandpipers, American avocet, black-necked stilts, Virginia rail, American coot, green herons, several hundred Swainson's thrushes, not to mention multiple grasshopper and Savannah sparrows, you would think that I likely had a yard near the coast, perhaps overlooking a marsh and or near some migration hotspot, maybe not in LA County at all. Well, I live in Los Feliz, less than a mile from the noisy 5 freeway and half a mile from the busy Los Feliz Boulevard, which is the main cut through from Hollywood to the east side of the city. And this is where that nightscape was recorded from. I'm on the southern edge of Griffith Park. You can see the pin there on this map of the city at night. And about a mile from the LA River. But other than that, there was nothing remarkable geographically about my location at all. I recorded all of these species as nocturnal migrants calling over my house in a niche area of birding that has been gaining more and more popularity over the last couple of decades, called Nocturnal Flight Call Recording, or NFC for short. Most birds migrate at night, and it's something not a lot of people, especially non-birders, are even aware of. And just because you live in a noisy, over-urbanized, overlit city doesn't mean it won't be good for recording these migrants. In fact, the more concrete urbanization, in fact, the more light pollution you have around you, it may actually produce better results. But before diving into the details of NFC, nocturnal flight call recording in LA, let's just take a moment to review how we got to the point where amateur birders and professional ornithologists are putting microphones outside at night to record the night skies. So this image here is Mashia's Seal Island off Maine. It's photos by Ralph Eldridge. Some of you may have seen it before. All those bright yellow dots are warblers. It's an amazing nocturnal migration that got halted by poor weather, and the lights of the lighthouse drew the birds in to find refuge. This and the next slide I'm going to show is an example of when nocturnal migration goes wrong or hits a speed bump, for example, bad weather causing fallouts. Many people talk about spark birds, a particular bird or a species that got them hooked on birding. For me, it wasn't a single bird or a birding moment, but rather bird migration that really got me hooked. Coming from the UK and Ireland, migration ensured that I could never get bored as the ebb and flow of the avian landscape changed from one day to the next during spring and fall. Much of my formative teen birding years are spent birding coastal migrant traps in the far west of the UK, where coastal scrub, battered by Atlantic storms, provided a haven for migrants coming in off the ocean. I wasn't really able to witness nocturnal migration back then, other than hearing the calls of Eurasian thrushes as they flew overhead. But I would see the product of nocturnal migration in the mornings. Coastal bushes that were dead the previous afternoon might have new migrants in the morning that had arrived overnight. And it was amazing to think that these birds had spent the last 12 hours of their migration in complete darkness, being battered by wind and rain as they struggled over a stormy ocean at night. So a few years ago, when I found out I could actually see this hidden nocturnal migration, I was instantly intrigued. And these events also occur on the other side of the Atlantic. German ornithologist Martin Grimm was kind enough to share these images. He was on a boat in the Baltic in the fall of 2015. And, again, this just sort of highlights the amazing feats of endurance all migrants, but especially nocturnal migrants, undertake. And for many of us, the only insight we get into nocturnal migration is when it goes wrong and there is some sort of fallout event. As you saw in the video, birds are really quite disoriented, looking for refuge. You can see in the photos here, we've actually got, I think, a Eurasian siskin sitting on the back of a Eurasian sparrowhawk that is eating a Eurasian siskin. And then below that, we have a brambling eating a meadow pipit. I was assured that the meadow pipit was dead before the brambling started eating it. We don't have killer bramblings out there. But this does just sort of highlight the amazing endurance that these birds have to go through. For centuries, Northern Hemisphere scholars speculated about whether bird migration existed at all, and wondered where their familiar summer birds went in the winter. A popular theory was transmutation, speculating that the birds, didn't go anywhere but changed into a completely different species or even animal. There were other fanciful notions of birds flying to the moon and back on their seasonal migrations, and stories of swallows found hibernating at the bottom of lakes. Indeed, the swallow hibernating theory, I think, persisted, well into the 19th century in some circles. The German arrow stork in the early 19th century, which was injured by an arrow while wintering in Africa and returned to Europe with the arrow still stuck in its body, helps cement the almost unbelievable evidence that these Northern European birds are flying to Africa and back every year. Now, obviously 150 years on, it is now well understood these birds do indeed migrate, many undertaking incredible feats, in terms of distance covered and navigation. Bird banding to track migration. In the bottom right, we see a yellowthroat being banded, and raptor watching sites and other diurnal migration watch points were appearing in North America and Europe in the early 20th century. And it was also discovered that with the advent of World War II radar, that it was not only detecting water droplets, but it could also pick up biological targets such as birds. Other improving technology in the latter part of the century gave us new insights and inventive ways to learn more about migration. My first ever job out of high school in the 80s was to track great white pelican flocks in Israel. And I would be on the ground and I would phone the professor, and he would jump in his microlight plane and actually fly with the flocks to really fully understand how they were migrating and where they were going. Something that was considered quite revolutionary at the time. Since then, we've obviously, we see it quite a lot with various reintroduction programs, and we've also seen it in the documentary Winged Migration. And we've also progressed, in the middle here, we see a prothonotary warbler with a little satellite tracking equipment on it. The advent of tiny transmitters and other high-tech devices, scientists are really able now to uncover, many of the mysteries of bird migration. Well, nowadays we can observe migration directly through visible migration, sitting in a fixed spot and watching as masses of birds fly in the same general direction, either singly or in groups to or from their wintering grounds. Bear Divide in LA County is a great example of a visible migration spot, and sometimes huge movements can be observed, like the 10,000 plus birds that were witnessed by Christine and Ryan Terrell on the 22nd of April last year, and impressive numbers the following day by many other observers. So while it is now fairly popular to watch birds migrating at daytime, how on earth can we amateur birders experience bird migration at night? Well, there are two main approaches to viewing nocturnal migration. You can either sit outside, perhaps even at your favorite visible migration spot, and you can watch the moon for passing silhouettes. These days, you can maybe even up your game and get a hold of an infrared scope. A number of birders I've noticed both in North America and Europe are doing this with quite interesting results. And you can also just simply sit there and listen to the birds calling overhead. You can check out now Cornell's Birdcast radar to see how busy it's going to be. And you can also check to see, when the full moon is going to be. Or you can leave your recording gear outside, giving you the opportunity to check identifications later, or simply because you need to sleep at night. In fact, the strongest nocturnal, flight call activity often occurs towards the end of the night when very few people are awake. And previously, to study this area, you needed expensive sound recording equipment, a lot of technical expertise, and a lot of time. Now, with the advent of smartphones, cheap digital recorders, free software to create spectrograms, the ability to record NFC's nocturnal flight calls over our apartment, houses, balconies, and yards is literally within all of our reach. Now, the indigenous people of our region, the Tongva, would have had a connected relationship with bird migration and were likely well aware of the nocturnal calls of migrating birds, especially waterfowl and the larger birds. So they would have been the first humans to note nocturnal flight call activity in our area. The first published data wasn't until 1896 when Libby published the first record to quantify the night flight call phenomenon, logging 3,600 calls from night migrating birds in 5 hours of listening. The concept of monitoring nocturnal flight calls existed in the 50s and 60s, but the labor and equipment needed was a major impediment, as you can see from the photo there on the left-hand side. Graeber and Cochrane produced some of the first reel-to-reel recordings in the late 50s, and these pictures are from their paper. The middle illustration shows a theoretical diagram of the reach of the microphone. Bill Gunn recorded night migrants from a Toronto skyscraper in the late 50s, and there were others recording sporadically in the 70s and 80s. But it was a pizza delivery boy and University of Minnesota student, Bill Evans, who had a life-changing moment and really brought nocturnal flight call recording to the fore in North American birding. While camping at a state park, he was witness to an incredible nocturnal passage of migrants. I think it was something like 100 black-billed cuckoos an hour. And from that point on, he dedicated his life to nocturnal flight call recordings. He produced a cassette of thrush calls that I think was probably the most heavily bootlegged cassette in North American birding circles at the time. It found its way into the hands, I think, of every serious North American birder. He recorded in those days on a hi-fi VCR, which he used, I think, up until the early 2000s, when he was then able to record directly to a computer. Not content with one listening station, he built a network of VCR stations across New York State in the early 90s, and has devoted 35 plus years, to what he's described as an addiction to trying to identify and see what is happening in the skies at night. By the mid-90s, he was also involved in the software development for automated flight call detection. And then he teamed up with another nocturnal flight call enthusiast, Michael O'Brien, who spent decades recording the daytime flight calls of migrants at visible migration hotspots like Cape May, in order to build an ID guide to flight calls of migrants. And they published their seminal book in 2002, Flight Calls of Migratory Birds of Eastern North American Land Birds. It's now out of print, but recordings are available free online, and there is going to be an update promised soon. You'll notice in that photo of Bill Evans and Michael O'Brien that they are recording during the day, which is obviously absolutely critical to building an identification guide, so that we can be certain that the flight calls that are being recorded and the spectrograms are produced are 100% solid identifications. As you'll see, there is quite a lot of hypotheticals around nocturnal flight calls, so you at least need that foundation of a guide that's built on daytime calls. Radar studies have the advantage of being able to detect and quantify birds flying at high altitudes, but a disadvantage is that most birds cannot be identified at species level. When listening to nocturnal migration, it's basically the other way around. We can identify many callers to species level, or at least family level, but it's much more difficult to estimate numbers and impossible to detect birds that don't call or just simply outside of the range of our hearing or mics. And high radar reflectivity itself is not always accompanied by high NFC detections, suggesting that birds flying overhead might not always be detected because they fly too high or they're simply not calling. There also seems to be some data that suggests that not all species are giving nocturnal flight calls upon takeoff, but rather several hours later when they're at a migrating elevation. So these radar blooms that we see here at sunset and for a few hours afterwards may not be detectable on our mics because the birds simply aren't calling. So if we go back to that big visible migration day that they had at Bear Divide last April on the 22nd and again on the 23rd, this is what that radar is. Let's see if I can. There we go. So you can see sort of a lot of the main activity was sort of happening around, the 11 a.m. to 3 a.m. time. Maybe I can play it again. You see these big blooms of birds around Los Angeles. Nothing really compared to what they were getting necessarily on the East Coast, but still quite impressive. Now, my nocturnal flight calls for those nights were quite disappointing. I mean, during the morning, I was certainly seeing a little slice of what was being seen at Bear Divide. It was clear there was something happening even in my neighborhood. I was seeing larger numbers and variety than previous days. I even had a beautiful singing Scots oriole drop into the yard briefly on the 22nd. So it was clear there was a lot of visible migration going on. But while they were observing 10,000 passerines in the morning at Bear Divide, my nocturnal recordings on both evenings, just produced Swainson's thrushes and a few Lazuli buntings. Yet looking at this radar, it was clear there was a lot of nocturnal migration happening. Now, interestingly, Bear Divide, with all that observer coverage, had one visual on a Swainson's thrush over the entire 2 days and never have particularly high counts of that species compared to the nocturnal callers that I'm picking up. And if we were to look at that checklist, there will be other species on there. Flycatchers and vireos are not nocturnal callers, so there's no surprise that we wouldn't be picking those up. But tanagers, buntings, grosbeaks, and warblers are, and warblers like Wilson's have a very distinctive flight call. And there was something like 2,000 Wilsons recorded at Bear Divide on the 23rd. I even had double digits in my yard that morning, so it wasn't as if it was a highly localized passage. It leads to a bunch of questions I don't have answers to, but hopefully as more people do nocturnal recordings, we can maybe get some answers. Perhaps the warblers are flying too high to be recorded nocturnally, certainly with my equipment. They're certainly going to be quite faint compared to Swainson's thrush. Perhaps there's altitude plays a role here. The warblers could be coming down. And then obviously Swainson's thrushes are very skulky birds, which maybe doesn't lend themselves well to being seen at visible migration spots. Perhaps they're coming down close to dawn and then they stay down hidden for the daytime hours. I was watching my yard very methodically every morning, and it's a small yard, very small postage stamp size yard. There's a lot of cover in it. And I finally did see a Swainson's thrush, in late April, just a brief view as it sort of flew from one side of the yard to the other. And then when I checked my camera trap at the water feature, that bird, I think it was probably the same bird, had been around for a couple of days. It'd been coming to the water feature in the morning. So I think it's quite possible that, Swainson's thrushes are obviously being overlooked by many of us in all of the areas that we're checking when we go out birding during the day. But they're quite a good bird to catch on nocturnal flight calls. They're quite vocal and they make a very distinctive call. But certainly this is one example where nocturnal flight call study will reveal, interesting migration data not picked up by our daytime observations. Most of our understanding of migration patterns comes from visual or audio surveys during approximately 10 to 12 hours of daylight by field ornithologists and amateur birders. As many birds, however, migrate in the night and may go undetected during the day, especially if they're secretive habits or if they don't stop in a particular area, it does lead to an open question of how much information regarding bird migration is not observed through the daytime observations alone. So why do so many birds migrate at night? Well, nocturnal migrants minimize depredation from hawks. Presumably owls may take migrants. In fact, recently there was a bat discovered in Europe that was feeding on nocturnal migrants in the Mediterranean. I don't think anything like that has been discovered here. They can avoid overheating. And then another major advantage is they can feed during the day when they're resting. Daytime migrants, if they're resting at night, they can't feed. And then of course, if they are using celestial navigation, they'd be able to use that at night. So what are nocturnal flight calls? Well, they are short calls given by birds migrating at night. Most species of North America's migrant land birds make their transcontinental flights at night, and many species give short vocalizations of fly. They can include short calls, partial songs, and other sounds. They maintain contact in groups, a bit like air traffic control. And the migration is likely very complex. There was an interesting study where the transmitters were attached to Swainson's thrushes in Illinois. These were birds that didn't have any mountain passes to clear. And I think the traditional thinking was that, these Swainson's thrushes, or in fact, any of these migrants would behave a bit like an airplane. You use a lot of energy and resources taking off to reach your migrating altitude, and then you just stay at that altitude. And that's the most efficient use of energy and resources. Well, you know, these thrushes were doing constant altitude changes throughout their migration. And at this point, I think largely unexplained. You know, that part is certainly, you know, quite odd. You know, they're possibly responding to fine scale variation in, you know, atmospheric conditions. Cities and towns can create strong thermals during the day, and that persists into the beginning of the night. Perhaps they're using the lift from these thermals to increase their altitude without increasing their flight costs. But they're also attracted to lights as well as those on communication towers, and they descend over those areas, after which they then ascend again to a higher altitude. A final possibility is that the altitude changes involve orientation or navigation strategies. Evans surmises it quite beautifully. He sort of talks about this nocturnal flight perhaps being just this Zen-like experience for these birds. You know, those earlier visuals I showed of fallouts, obviously no doubt stressful events when, you know, nocturnal migration is not going well. However, when things are going well and they are flying for hours in pitch black, uninterrupted, with just the calls of other migrants helping to push them along, you know, perhaps they're in a zone like a marathon runner. You know, it certainly has been also shown in studies that, you know, energy use on a migratory flight is maybe not as expensive as expected, and heart rates rose on ascent and actually decreased and plateaued, you know, during normal nocturnal flight. And then there's other species that actually don't call. So Vireo's flycatchers, I mentioned that already. They don't give nocturnal flight calls, apparently, it seems. And then these calls can also be given at any time of year, but seem to be most prominent during migration periods, fall and spring. So why is it important? Why on earth am I talking about it? Well, certainly while stations are quite common in the East, there's quite a lot of people doing it further east. There seem to be very few stations out here in the West. We don't get these large numbers of nocturnal migrants, you know, that the recordists back east, you know, record out here. So it's probably a little less exciting. That's probably one reason. But there is still lots that we can learn about NFC identification of Western migrants, and, you know, lots to contribute towards our understanding of migration in LA County. You know, it's hard for me to know how many stations there are out here, but, you know, I know there was one in San Diego. Obviously, I was recording in LA, and there seemed to be a few at least 2 in Monterey County. And in spring, you know, these stations detected Swainson's thrushes in their respective counties 4 to 5 days before the first visual record. You know, I'm basing this on eBird, so, you know, may not be comprehensive. But, you know, these are birds that would have otherwise gone undetected. And in the fall, some of these stations detected significantly more grasshopper sparrows, another skulky but vocal nocturnal migrant, than would be expected based on the number of detections during the day. And of course, there's conservation. You know, there generally isn't awareness in the general public and city planners about nocturnal migration. Understanding the timing, magnitude, and species composition of migrating birds is critical for bird conservation, particularly when it comes to assessing populations of potential human-made hazards during migration. For example, knowing exactly when and where migrant birds, you know, will help assess where wind turbines, a demonstrated hazard for birds, are placed and when they're operated. Today's nocturnal migrants face a unique hazard, light pollution, particularly in urban centers where lights and tall buildings coexist. The disorienting effects of lights can cause birds to collide into buildings, drive them to exhaustion, forcing them to the ground, where they become victims to other hazards such as cats and moving cars, etc. You know, many of us will have seen these images on the left of nocturnal migrants confused by city lights, striking buildings, overhead wires. Some of the communication towers with their red flashing lights kill thousands of birds per night. There's one in Wisconsin, which I think in a 40-year period, you know, 120,000 birds had been collected as dead underneath that tower. Audubon and ABC, American Bird Conservancy, lobby for lights out campaigns in various cities. And there are some cities like Chicago, which have really embraced it. LA was ranked as the 4th most dangerous city in the country for spring migrating birds. And recent studies have shown that birds that use nocturnal flight calls to help navigate are more likely to collide with lighted buildings compared to other migrating birds that don't produce calls. You know, presumably these calls are luring other birds in. So I think the more data and detail we can get about nocturnal migrating birds, you know, producing nocturnal flight calls in LA County is only a good thing. And for me personally, as the LA River gets more developed over the next few years, we'll see more and more bridges being built. You know, let's try and avoid the suspension bridges like this one at Atwater Park, which partly funded by tax dollars and is really an excellent migrant bird killing machine. I see many near misses and strikes during the daylight hours, so I can only imagine what happens at night. And then further to complicate matters, the bridge is also lit up at night. So how do we hear them? I do just want to mention, you know, for these next slides, there's a few sort of technical slides here. I borrowed heavily from an excellent presentation that an expert recorder, Marquette Muchler, had put together. She's an expert in this area and she needs to be credited for what comes next, although all errors are my own. So in terms of hearing these birds, you know, these calls are given by several birds. They're not limited to migrating passerines. For instance, ducks, rails. I think, you know, we would have heard the Virginia rail at the very beginning in that nightscape. Shorebirds, herons, and others are all common nocturnal flight call birds. They're most commonly heard from sundown to sunrise during migration periods. They usually peak after 11 p.m. and continue until sunrise for a morning flight. Generally, the best time is 11 p.m. to 3 a.m., but that very much is a generalization. In fact, thrushes are often, Swainson's thrush is often actually a little bit later, closer to dawn. In order to identify the calls being heard, you should really record them. You know, practice by ear can help to ID some, but certainly not all nocturnal flight calls. The majority are given in a higher frequency range, meaning that even if you may have a noisy neighborhood, you can actually still identify most of the calls. And we'll look at that nightscape again, but you know, you may have noticed that the sirens and the train horns and people talking were in a lower frequency from the bird calls. And so it's possible to actually eliminate some of that noise just so that you can hear the bird calls. Now, we don't need to have big, bulky equipment like Graeber and Cochrane back in the 50s. Pretty much anything goes. So at the very low end, people use their phone. You may want to have it near a mains outlet. You can hang it out a window, extension cable or something if you don't have an outlet close enough. But yes, some people get actually great results. I've personally not tried it, but I see no reason why it wouldn't be good. I use my phone when I'm in the field all the time to do recordings, and I feel like the recordings I get from my phone are not bad and every bit as good sometimes as the recordings I get with my digital recorder. So it's definitely worth looking at if you're looking to not put any money into this. Otherwise, you know, popular items are these sort of digital recorders, these sort of handheld ones that can fit in the pocket. My setup is actually the one in the middle there, middle top, where it's on a little travel tripod that's actually on my deck. It's a small recorder. You know, brand new, they go for less than $200, but you may be able to find something on eBay that's even cheaper. Mine does not plug into the mains, it just uses batteries, but I just have rechargeable batteries that I just circulate every day. And now you can usually get 2 nights recordings out of them. I have friends here who on the Gulf Coast are using just lavalier mic, getting great results. And then the bucket there option, that's actually something that Bill Evans sells. And that's when you get really serious about it. There are people who have it in, you know, acts as a parabola. They have a microphone inside a flower pot or a bucket, and it can actually get attached to your roof with a cable that then runs in, I guess, through the attic directly to a computer. And it's automated so that it sets to record at certain times and stop recording. And also if you're PC based, I'm not, but if you're PC based, there's lots of software that will actually pull out the files for you or find the calls and create clips for you, so you don't have to go searching. And if you're really proficient at computer software, there is now even software that will try and identify the calls for you, and I think probably does quite a good job as well. Lance Bennett did a couple of great webinars on bird recording. I'm not going to go over those in terms of settings. Pretty much what he talked about there is the same advice. It applies for nocturnal flight calls too, in terms of your settings. In general, try and find a quiet place away from AC units, electrical interference. Try to record at 48K and in mono if possible, just to save space on your memory cards. So a long-standing impediment has been call identification. The night flight calls of many species, such as warblers and sparrows, are like single cricket chirps. They're typically between 0.05 and 0.25 seconds long. Their high frequencies, 5 to 9 kilohertz, make them especially difficult for the human ear to distinguish. And so, it is important to try and, base your recordings on known flight calls that have been taken from birds during the daytime. There are certain calls that are easily identifiable by ear, and others that can be identified within a season or so at most. And this includes thrushes and herons and some shorebirds. There are other flight calls should definitely not be attempted without having a recording, and this includes most warblers, some sparrows, shorebirds. And then I do want to just highlight, to get everyone's expectations, if you are thinking about trying this, most of these types of flight calls will be probably left to SPR. For NFC, it's really important to just be realistic about how much we still don't know. To identify flight calls from call, you need to view the recorded call in what is called a spectrogram. Free software such as Audacity, Raven Light will do the job. I think Audacity seems to be probably, from what I can tell, one of the most popular programs that people use. It's totally free. So, there is a way to start doing these nocturnal flight calls without, spending any money at all. There's commercial software. If you have Adobe Cloud, there's something called Adobe Audition, which actually works really well. I use that too. And then these examples down here of some warblers, these are all recorded from daytime flight calls. You'll see that they're all quite similar, and particularly in a nocturnal situation where the recording may not be as clear as this, it's understandable why most people would leave many of these Western warblers as just spurs. You certainly should know how to read and understand the spectrogram. They're a visual representation of a sound and its frequencies. For musicians, think of it, I guess, kind of like reading sheet music. So 3 main things to look at: the frequency of the sound, the length of the sound, and the type and the shape of the sound. So here we've got actually 2 sparrows that are quite different. In that recording at the beginning of the webinar, they may have sounded virtually identical, but when you look on the spectrogram, you can see that, white-crowned sparrow is an ascending call. It's generally over 6.5K. It's 6 to 90 milliseconds in length, and it ascends. It's rising and usually double-banded, where Savannah goes the other direction. It's a descending call, so usually got 2 or 3 bands to it. But their length and their frequency is very similar. One is ascending, one's descending. So the frequency, which is the y-axis, it's a measurement of sound waves per second. It's one of the most important aspects to identifying calls, as it tells you how high or low the call was. Pitch, you'll hear people talk about pitch, we all do. That call was high pitch or low pitch. That is a subjective, human assessment of how high or low a sound may be. Most of the software I mentioned will automatically be set by kilohertz for that frequency on the y-axis. But there are some generalizations here. Warbler and sparrow calls usually between that 6 to 10K range, while other birds such as thrushes, herons, rails lie below 5K. And as you can see here, we've got, you know, sparrows, Audubon's warbler, etc., all in that range, in that sort of 7 to 8K range, whereas Swainson's thrush is further down on the scale. We can ignore noises over 10K. You know, these are usually insects, bats, and out of the range of human hearing. And I'm usually ignoring anything sort of below 1K as well. That's usually, you know, you can find owls around that range, but generally a lot of that noise down there is I find human generated or other animal generated noise. Then time is along the x-axis here, and this is a number line. You know, when the file's imported to your software, the number line will start at 0. And, you know, using this number line will aid definitely in your identification. Most importantly, measuring how long a single call is made. You can determine its length in seconds or milliseconds. You know, warblers and sparrows, for instance, can be separated from each other by how many milliseconds the call is. White-crowned sparrow and Audubon's warbler, for instance, very similar looking shape. Audubon's warbler is a much shorter call compared to a white-crowned sparrow, you know, not by a small amount, but by a fairly significant amount. Then you need to visualize the type and the shape. So what direction is it going in? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it flat? Does it have multiple frequency bands, or is it just one, you know, multiple in terms of polyphonics? Is the call straight, or is it modulated with lots of waves? So, you know, look at that yellow warbler, very distinctive, very different from the Audubon's warbler. Gives that very buzzy call that, you know, many of us are probably familiar with when one flies over. And then look how beautiful that Wilson's warbler is. I mean, I love the shape of that. It reminds me of that, you know, electronic ohm symbol. Again, very distinctive. You'll see I've got multiple calls in all these spectrograms here. You know, this is just simply, you know, to highlight how variable the call can be. That they won't always be totally identical. They will range in length and sometimes also in pitch, as you can see here. And in the nocturnal flight call world, there are a few bits of jargon used when we classify calls. These terms can be combined to describe calls. We've got the upsweeps we talk about on the left here. We've got the downsweep, like a Savannah Sparrow. We've got double barred, double banded, refers to the presence of multiple bands. And then you have zeep, you have that modulated wavy call. You know, you'll see that on Lincoln Sparrow and, you know, Lazuli Bunting, for instance. And there are often, you know, times where similar groups of birds will give these similar nocturnal calls. Upsweeps, certain sparrows and pretty much most Western warblers. Downsweeps is Savannah Sparrow on the west here. I think that's probably really the only thing we need to be concerned about, given the downsweep. You've got zeeps, which I mentioned, Lincoln Sparrow, Lazuli Bunting, blue grosbeak's another one that gives a beautiful zeep. You know, these groupings are not comprehensive, and there are several nocturnal flight calls that don't fit into these categories, you know, particularly obviously shorebirds and herons and that sort of stuff. And also, you know, our understanding of nocturnal flight calls of Western migrants still very much in its infancy. Next, I wanted to just show you, really just sort of highlight, you know, how important it really is to sort of look at the spectrograms. I think if you're unfamiliar with sparrow calls, you may listen to all of these and feel like they all sound the same, but we'll then look at the spectrograms as well, and we can see they're different. So I think, you know, we would have listened to that and we may think, well, they all sound identical, or maybe some of the more experienced birders will have detected a few differences there. There's actually 9 different species of sparrow that were making that call. And so fortunately, we have them recorded. Now, I actually cheated on these. These are actually daytime calls, but these are all, so I can be 100% certain that I have the identification correct. You know, it does sort of highlight the importance of getting a spectrogram. So I'm going to play that again now the same track just with the spectrogram and the name of the bird. It goes by rather quickly, I'm sorry, but you take a look at the spectrogram and you'll see sort of how different they are for all of these species. So for sparrows, I was certainly finding that there wasn't a lot available for nocturnal flight calls for the western sparrows. I think, you know, if you're recording further east, there's a load of resources. There's a lot of people who have great ID guides. So I had to sort of build a lot of these from scratch. And at the end of this, and maybe we can make a PDF or something and put it on the website, there is a link to a Google sheet that I have of western sparrows and western warblers, again, all taken, flight calls, all taken from daytime birds. But, you know, there's a number of sort of birds like brewer's sparrow, et cetera, and golden crown sparrow that there wasn't a lot of reference on. So I spent the last 2 falls up at the Toyon landfall in Griffith Park, which is excellent for sparrows. And I just have my recorder with me and I just spend a couple of hours most mornings in the fall kicking up sparrows and recording their flight calls and just trying to build a library of spectrograms. Here I've also got Audubon's warbler there as an example, just to show you sort of how short the warbler calls are compared to sparrows. I think it should be worth noting, you know, that these sort of U-shaped calls, which is song and fox, and probably, you know, in many ways golden crowned and chipping, you know, many of the experienced nocturnal flight recordists consider them maybe indistinguishable. I don't know so much about golden crowned sparrow, whether that would be, but particularly if you don't have a excellent recording of it at night, you know, it can be extremely difficult to separate, certainly song and fox. But I would also lump golden crowned and chipping into that as well. And so again, you know, you may be faced with, if you record a sort of U-shaped sparrow call, you may have to sort of, for now, put it down as a spur, sparrow spur. Some of the other sparrows are a little more distinctive. I do think, you know, Lincoln's is very distinctive. You know, Brewer's sparrow is a distinctive call. Vesper sparrow has this sort of check mark shape to it. So some of the others should be fine to record, and all are possible. I haven't included grasshopper here, but it is in the sheet. That's a very long call. It's well over 100 milliseconds. Some of them are sort of 150 milliseconds, and that's basically fairly sort of flat, slightly rising. Very fine modulations on it, quite a distinctive call. And the same thing also for the Western warblers. Again, there wasn't a great deal out there to sort of help identify nocturnal flight calls. I mean, they may not be identifiable species anyway, I don't know, but there wasn't a lot there on the Western warblers. So this is built from a number of places. In fact, you know, big thanks to Ryan Terrell, who last spring was recording all the warblers and sent me his recordings. And I did my best to sort of go through them. And as he was shouting out birds, try and, you know, dice up the spectrograms to try and make, you know, a library of calls. I also have a silk oak tree that's at sort of my height from the deck, and last spring spent, you know, a few hours every morning just recording the flight calls as warblers as they would come into that tree and then leave that tree. And then I've also, you know, gone onto Xeno Canto and downloaded some calls and made some spectrograms as well. Just, you know, I've tried to get as many calls in there as possible just to try to highlight the diversity. You know, no single call looks the same, and there's slight variations in frequency as well, and shape. Wilson's warbler and yellow, as we saw, they have beautifully distinctive calls. So you get one of those and it's a celebration because you feel like, oh, I can actually finally identify something here. But I do feel like the other calls, we can at least at this point say they are warbler spurs. I think we can separate them from sparrows. And I do think as more and more people do this and hopefully join me in this adventure, that you know, maybe we will be able to separate some of these warblers. So this, if you go ahead and do a recording, this is sort of the file that you'll get. If you look across the x-axis there, we've got over 4.5 hours, which can look quite daunting. You think, well, how on earth am I going to go through 4 hours of recording? I don't have that sort of time. But this is where the visual nature of nocturnal flight calls comes in. We will take this file. One of the first things I'll do is I'll just raise the volume on it so that I can see things in that higher frequency range. You'll see that it's very hot at the bottom here. I don't need to raise the, I don't need to hear much in that area. It's already very loud, and that's generally not where I'm going to find the birds anyway. I'm going to be finding them in the higher range where you can see we've got less noise. So I'll raise the volume and then I zoom in. I zoom in so that I can see maybe about anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute of that recording on my screen. And then I basically just high speed scroll through it. So I can get through, if it's a quiet night, and really most nights are quiet nights, I can get through, 3 hours in about 15 minutes. And so you can get through an entire 6-8 hour file, in less than an hour, 40 minutes. It might take longer if it's busy and you're having to find, having to pull stuff out. But in general, I can go through them pretty quickly. I don't have a lot of time to spend to this. So I think, if you decide to pursue this, you make your own rules in terms of how much time you spend. You may decide you'll put your microphone out at 11 o'clock and you just decide, I'm just going to listen to the first 3 hours and nothing else. And certainly I've been tempted by that, but I hate the idea of leaving too soon. It's always that feeling of you're at a bird site and you're the one who leaves and everybody sees what it was that they're looking for. And I'm always scared that if I don't go to the very end, I'm going to miss something. But you can obviously choose how much time you want to devote to this. So I'll zoom in so that I can see about a minute of my timeline, and then this is what I will see. The row of consistent lines you see there, that's all insect noise. I don't need to go and check. I know it's insect noise. I don't need to go check any of that stuff. At the very bottom of my screen, I see that very hot area. That's just low white noise, rumbling of traffic. But in the middle of the screen there, I see two shining little dots, and that's a wonderful thing to see. And those are actually Swainson's thrushes. So I'll zoom in, and the first thing I'll do is I'll play it just to be sure, because it could well be a wind chime, some other weird noise, some animal or something like that. I'll check that it really does sound like a Swainson's thrush, and if it does, then I'll go and make a spectrogram of it. Now you may sort of worry that I don't live in a quiet neighborhood, or my recordings are going to get ruined. Well, as you heard from that very first nightscape, it was pretty noisy and maybe quite hard to hear some of the birds. If we look at this spectrogram, this one I've got in Audacity, you'll see the train horns there. You see the sirens. See, they're all well below the Swainson's thrush. We got a whole bunch of insects there that are very conveniently below the sparrows and above the Swainson's thrush. So there are actually ways, if you wanted to, remove that. I don't like the heavy-handed approach. Some people would just literally sort of delete all that low-end frequency. I think that actually makes it sound worse. It sounds hissy. What I do like to do, which is something Hollywood movies have been doing forever, which is I'll find a quiet bit of recording in my 8 hours. There's usually somewhere in there where I don't have train horns, and I will literally simply just copy and paste. I'll take that quiet area that's in that range from 2K and below, and I'll copy and paste over those train horns, and I'll copy and paste over those sirens. I'm not going to touch the bird calls. I'm not going to affect them in any way. I'm not going to run a filter on them. And I'll do the same for the insects as well. I actually find there's usually little areas in the night where the insects aren't making a noise, and I can copy and paste those across as well. So I can actually kind of get rid of all that extraneous noise so I can hear, the birds a little bit better. And let's take a listen then to, that nightscape with all of that other stuff removed. So it's not perfect by any means, but it does allow you to hear some of these calls a bit better. However, there is one nocturnal flight call recording killer, and it isn't planes, trains, automobiles, or AC units, but it's northern mockingbird, which unfortunately sings all night in the spring. I'm sure many of you probably hear them as well. And their song is in the same frequency range as thrushes, herons, rail shorebirds. They don't usually often seem to go as high as the sparrows and warblers, but particularly when I'm looking for Swainson's thrushes, they really do kind of ruin it. And sometimes I'll open a file and it's 6 hours of mockingbird singing. I just throw the file away. I won't bother wasting my time trying to dig through it, because as you'll see on that record on the spectrogram here, it's pretty much nonstop. And then to throw insult to injury, by mid-May, because they have heard so many Swainson's thrushes going over, they start doing impressions of Swainson's thrush. And so now you have mockingbirds ruining your recording and also doing Swainson's thrush impressions. They do a very good impression, except for the fact that the call is a bit too long, so you can usually catch them out. So hopefully, if you try this, you're not totally plagued by them as I often am. If you are going to go upload these recordings to eBird, there are some important protocols to follow. And I would recommend sort of reading those. Do have to remember we're submitting data for science and scientists. I think, it is very important that we're conservative in our IDs and we're not messing up data by being a little too enthusiastic about some of the calls. I think particularly at nighttime, it can play tricks with your head a little bit. I think, a distant baby crying or a car horn beep or some other noise that during the day you wouldn't give a second thought to, at night when there's no other noises, you can start listening to it thinking it's something crazy or weird, bird-like. So, I think, we do have to be careful about that. They've got some basic instructions in terms of normalizing, which, is quite easy to do. It's basically raising the volume and also having a lead in. I must admit, I like that too, when people post calls hoping for an identification. It really is quite hard to judge when there's, half a second before the call plays. I think your brain needs time to listen to just the background noise for a few seconds before you actually hear the bird. I think eBird likes you to create another account. And then it's very important that you select nocturnal flight call from your pull down and that you mark the checklist as incomplete. And then I think ideally they want it broken up into submissions of 1 hour increments. They don't want a whole 8 hour checklist. I'll post some links here. There's an excellent Facebook group, which actually is adminned by Corey Huzik, who's an LA birder, which, people are posting all the time, great workarounds on how to get your data into eBird. If you maybe, want to actually collect your data in spreadsheets first, and how you can even upload, checklists in 1 hour increments to make life just a little bit easier. These are some of the sources. I mentioned that Evans and O'Brien book, which unfortunately isn't available, but all the calls are available on Bill Evans' website, oldbird.org. The Sound Approach to Birding is a European version, which is very, very helpful. They have a great website too. And then Peterson Field Guides actually has a lot of calls online, again, for free, for reference. The usual thanks here, which I've mentioned already, to Marquette Muchler, and also, a lot of the spectrograms you saw today, some of them are from Ryan Terrell's Diurnal recordings and others from Zeno Canto. A mixture of those are mine. Here's some, links. There is a Facebook group, super helpful. You may not want to inundate it at first with every possible call you have. I mean, if there is enough interest in LA County for this, perhaps I can set up a Slack group or something like that, and we can share spectrograms, calls, that sort of stuff. people want help and tips. But this Facebook group has been pulling together lots of resources. Definitely has less of a Western emphasis in that group, but still a lot of incredibly knowledgeable people on it. Some more websites here. There's YouTube videos on how to set it. I mean, they're pretty much resources for everything in terms of what equipment should I buy or what equipment should I use, all the way through to how do I set up the software and how do I even identify the call. I'll put a link here. There's a link here for my LA County flight calls web sheet, which, you know, I can always update as we get new calls and things like that to add to it. I'm happy to do that. And then I think, you know, the basic thing I'd like to really sort of hammer home is be patient. Don't put your recorder out and expect the first night to be flooded with fantastic birds. You know, many nights, certainly the first half of April, are going to be quite quiet. And there'll be most nights where you get no calls at all. The upside to that is you can actually scroll through your files quite quickly. The nights where there's lots of calls obviously will take more time. And it will take you time to understand how to go through your recordings quickly. You know, for me, the first few seasons, I'm stopping on every little hit that I see, and it's usually a door slam, a baby crying, a dog barking. But after a while, you actually get used to those noises, and you just know that when you see that noise, okay, that's a dog bark, I'm moving on, I'm not stopping. And that's really the only way to sort of get through these things. So there's the visual component to it, which helps you hone in on what to look for. And then obviously, you know, you need your ears to then listen to it and check that, is it a bird call or is it something else? I liken it a lot to sort of birding your local patch, your local area, your hotspots that you like to go to. You know, 99% of the time, you know, you're not really seeing much at all. And then there's that one bit of excitement where something, a shorebird or something flies over and gives a call that is identifiable. You know, and so for many, probably the first season, you probably won't have any idea what you're doing, and you will be spending a lot of time because you're just getting used to how to go through the calls. But I would urge you to stick with it, because it will only get better as you get more practice for it. And that is my show.
Andy, that was fascinating. It really was incredible. Thank you very much for presenting all of that. Before I forget, you mentioned that you were going to post your Google Sheet to eBirders. Could you also post your resources page?
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just make a PDF of that resources page, which has the Google Sheet link on, and the Facebook group. And, you know, I'm sure I'm missing a few things, but there's a lot of things there that can get people started at least. So yeah, we'll PDF for that, and people will be able to find that on the LA Birders webinar page. Great,
thanks. And I did notice behind you, it's getting pretty dark in LA right now. Yeah. So does that mean that your recorder is going in the bucket on your roof right now?
Right now. I'll be climbing up the roof. Don't tell my wife. There's a bucket going on there. I actually want to do the Bill Evans thing. I want to put buckets on it. Everybody who is a participant tonight, I'll be coming to your house and attaching a bucket to your roof. So we can build a station, a network of them.
Yeah, Lance chatted that, following up on my earlier comment, the distortion was probably caused by the fact that Andy added quieter noise on top of regular low-frequency urban rumble sirens. Oh, I see. Before that, he mentioned that it sounded distorted. I think he was talking about when you were when you cut and pasted,
removed some of the sirens.
Right. Well, but you didn't remove it. You cut and pasted.
I just replaced the sirens with an area of the evening where there were no sirens in that same frequency. Just so that I can hear the sparrows underneath the siren. You know?
Now, does Audacity actually allow you to delete a frequency?
I mean, you can delete frequencies, and some people do that. Some experienced people do that. Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but I do find that that's a little distracting. I find it sounds hissy, or it sounds like it's underwater or something, and actually can make it sound harder to hear the call. So
Okay.
I can just sort of copy and paste so that we have that same level of background noise.
Or reference even, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Very, very interesting. We do have a question.
But you don't need to do that. It's just something I do so that I can hear it. You know, I live in a noisy neighborhood. Sometimes the best bird calls when there's a helicopter going over or something like that. But if you live in a quiet area, you may not need, you know, it's maybe quiet all night, and, you know, you never need to worry about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a couple of questions. First from Lance Benner. Lance asks, how much more sensitive are the roof sound buckets than your regular recorder?
I think they're good. I think they're very good. I think, you know, a parabola definitely helps, although, you know, that is just a bucket. I think it's like bucket with, you know, saran wrap on top of it. But I sort of feel like Bill Evans must know what he's doing. And so, you know, yeah, I think he gets publication quality nocturnal flight calls, you know, if there is such a thing. But yeah, you know, he gets great quality. That's just not something I'd be allowed to do or I'd want to do, you know. So, well, but I do need to look into maybe just a parabola, you know, some smaller sort of parabola or something on my deck. As you saw, my setup there is pretty basic. And probably there's a lot of people who already have recorders just like that already that they use in the field. And so, you know, all of those recordings I got were just from a recorder like that. I do think if you've got access and want to invest in, you know, parabolas and better mics, and certainly a better recorder, I think you could probably do a lot better than me. And you know, I talked about not being able to get warbler calls. I bet maybe they were calling. I just couldn't get them in my, you know, microphone reach.
Well, and also parabola might actually cut out those dog barks or quiet them down, and right. Sirens and things, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they if you've got it pointed at the sky, you may well be able to remove some of that.
Great. Lily asks, would an iPhone work well if I put one in a bucket?
I think I've never used the iPhone, but there are people who do, and there are people I think on the Nocturnal Facebook group who do and get decent results. I don't know that you need to put in a bucket. You might want to experiment, like with and without. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I know people who just literally put them in a bag out the window. You know, not everybody has access to a balcony or a deck or a yard or a driveway. And so if you're in an apartment, you know, out the window will work.
So when you say put in a bag, you're actually meaning, so the bag acts as a parabola?
No, just...
Whoa, Andy, you just, either you locked or I locked.
In a bag and, you know, just hanging out the window. But yeah, there's no additional sort of help there.
Okay.
So I do think, you know, I'd say to Lily, just try it both ways. I've had friends who've tried recording with and without a parabola or a bucket, a homemade parabola, and have found no difference. So I don't know. I don't know what the result will be. But you may not need the bucket, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Naresh Satyan asks, is there a direction of the sky you point to if you have a directional microphone or a parabola?
I point to the south, which is great. I'm assuming from the spring, that's the direction the birds are coming from. But I don't actually change it, you know, because I face south. I don't go and move my microphone in the fall to the front of the house. So, but yeah, I have it pointed up at the sky. But I don't know that makes a big difference. I think the most important thing is to try and find somewhere that is quiet, and electrical interference will obviously play a big part of it. You know, try and keep it away from there was somebody recently on the Nocturnal Facebook group who'd been recording for a while for I think, experienced, and they were like, I can't figure it out. My recordings are all ruined with this weird electrical noise. And it stops at around 10 or 11 p.m. And then picks up again, various times of the night. And he'd figured out it was the dimmers in his light. Every time someone turned the dimmer on at some point in the light, it interfered. And somebody else has said, yeah, the same thing happened to me. So I think you just, you probably want to keep it away from electrical appliances, try and keep it away from air conditioning units. Anything that would sort of ruin it is probably more important than which direction you point in.
Right. Interesting. Carrie Hunnewell asks, within what spectrum of altitudes are these calls generated?
It's an excellent question, Carrie. And I knew somebody might ask that, and I thought I needed to prepare, and I didn't. I don't know. I mean, I think at a guess, I think I can reach, sort of 300 feet or so. But that is a guess, and I need to do a test. I need to go up the street and play Swainson's thrush calls and go further away and see how far it does actually pick up. And that certainly is something that needs to be researched in terms of, what altitude these birds are flying at. As I mentioned, they change altitude, it seems, quite frequently, and sometimes come quite low, presumably attracted by lights, and other times, go higher, which, again, may explain some of the differences in why I'm recording Swainson's calls and no one's seeing them at Bear Divide, etc., and vice versa.
Yeah, interesting. So you recommend I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, no, it's a good question. It's one that I probably can answer easily. I just need to test it myself.
So you recommend putting a spotlight next to your recorder?
Dazzle the birds, put windows all around.
Well, no, I just want something.
You don't need to record them. You just come up, pick up the bodies in the morning.
Oh boy. No, I want something to attract them closer.
Right. Well, yes. I mean, it does go back to the first thing I mentioned, which is if you sort of feel like, oh, I live in downtown, or I live some area in a high rise and there's lights, and you may actually find you get a lot of recordings, and that part of it would be interesting. I would be interested to know, what are the recordings like, I don't know, in the Antelope Valley versus somebody who's closer to downtown. And I'd certainly love to know what people are recording towards the coast.
Absolutely.
In the fall, are you recording a lot more Swainson's thrushes? I don't get Swainson's thrushes here in the fall, but I wonder if you're closer to the coast, maybe you do. So I do think, there's a lot about migration in LA County that can be unearthed just by a number of us doing more of this.
Interesting. And also, I'm kind of curious on the, in the groups and all that, have any recordings been done outside of migration? In other words, do our sedentary birds make flight calls as well? I've run it sometimes
I've run it in July because I've been curious about shorebirds. You do get a lot of the local birds calling. I don't know that they're necessarily flight calls, but yes.
Oh, okay.
So even now, I've been recording the past 2 weeks and had few migrants and get bird calls most nights, but often it's towhees or wrens singing or something. So yeah, the local birds are quite active, but I don't know that they're necessarily flight calls.
Okay. That is interesting. I'm sorry. We have another question, if you don't mind me holding on to you for a second. We have a couple more questions from Lord Singh. Any comparisons of Pacific taxi flight calls with their eastern subspecies? E.g. Swainson's thrush, Wilson's, and Nashville warblers. The buzzy flight calls of yellow warblers are distinctive in the West, but lots of eastern warblers have buzzy flight calls, including Connecticut blackpoll, etc.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the warblers, yeah, I mean, the East Coast birders seem to know them quite well and seem to be able to separate most of them. I don't know specifically those ones you talked about, but yes, certainly I think yellow warbler would be separated from most of them. There's a great, I think Andrew Farnsworth has built a great sheet of warbler flight calls, and they all, even the eastern ones, a lot of them look fairly similar. But I do see that on the Facebook group they seem to be able to sort them out quite easily. And in terms of the Swainson's thrushes, I don't know if there's I don't know of a difference. Obviously we get the coastal form that migrates through our county, rather than the Sierra Cascade form that seems to migrate much further inland, doesn't come across our county. But I'm not aware or know if there's any differences. I suspect not, that you can separate the two, but I'm not aware.
Interesting. And Lance asks, LA County moon watches usually show that few birds are seen silhouetted against the moon near the coast. Many more are visible along the foothills. So, if there are audio recordings, presumably things would be quiet at the coast. An interesting idea to test. Also, identifying what the silhouettes.
Yeah, definitely interesting. I remember hearing that on the Channel Islands, in the fall, Nick Leatherby was hearing a lot of Swainson's thrushes, but again, sort of similar to the experience we have in the spring here, you hear them and it sounds like there's a lot going over, but then in the daytime, they're not easy to find. There's very few found, and doesn't quite match up with the recordings. But yeah, I'd love to know. Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't aware that the moon watching was producing less results on the coast. So yeah, presumably that would be held up in the recordings too. But yeah, I'd love to know. I'd love to hear what people are recording there. I was hoping maybe there may be shorebirds and terns and things like that. I don't know, but it'd be interesting.
That would be interesting. By the way, the moon watch is coming up, I think in about 10 days or so. So if this is something that is interesting, people out there, you might want to try your hand at doing the recordings and figuring out software before the moon watch, if you want to try to match up a little bit.
April 26th is the full moon.
Great, April 26th.
And now is a good time, if you are interested in, now's a good time to practice, just experiment, like you say, with different things, because what are we, we're a week away from Swainson's thrushes, and we should be getting those sort of in the last week of April, and so I feel like they're a fairly good introduction to nocturnal flight calls. I think if you put a microphone outside of it, whether it's a phone or not, I would hope that by late April and into May, you would at least get one or two Swainson's thrushes on your file. So that will at least make you feel like you achieved something. So I feel like that's a gimme. And so, yeah, I would do your testing, over the coming week so that you get ready for them when they start coming. And it would be really great to sort of get some proper count going. I had a few hundred in the spring, but I'm assuming my direction is only for a few hundred feet. I mean, if you had people doing it in Altadena, Pasadena, and maybe we could get a compilation of how many are actually flying over would be interesting.
That would be interesting. That would actually be really fascinating. Another question popped up. Hope you don't mind. Oh. From Lance, regarding moon watches, they can be productive for 3 to 4 nights before the full moon also, and you can start watching as soon as it gets dark. After the moon is full, it rises. After the moon is full, it rises later. Okay. Interesting, interesting. So you were saying, Andy, and I just want to mention also that the most productive recordings you're getting are between 11 and 3.
Yeah, generally that's the busier time, but
you leave your recorder out all night.
I try to put it out shortly after it gets dark. And you never know. Sometimes it's solitary sandpiper came through at sort of a 9 or 10 o'clock. So anything can happen at any time. And because I've got it recorded, I guess I'm just obsessive about why I might as well just go through it all. But yes, if you're short of time, having it run between 11 and 3 would probably capture most of what's happening, in your neighborhood.
Got it. Well, I don't see any more questions, Q&A popping up or chat. Mark, did you have any? Or Frank and Susan, did you guys have anything?
Thank you for all your hard work on that, Andy. That was great.
Good.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Very interesting, and thinking of sticking out my recorder at night.
Yeah, I'm going to head down to them and get my recorder right now. And But one more question. So you download it into Audacity and then use basically Audacity or Ravenlight to create a spectrogram and then look for your blips.
Yeah, when you download it into one of those programs, it automatically creates the whole evening or files as spectrograms. And then you can just scroll through at high speed, looking for things that look interesting. And then you can stop and listen and go, okay, that's nothing, and move on. Yeah. And depending on whether there are a lot of birds or not, you can go through that file pretty quickly.
Now, I have a real problem because I have a couple of really yappy little dogs next door. So they're probably the same frequency as Swainson's thrush.
No, I don't know. I mean, usually dogs are lower, so I think you'll be fine. But
okay.
I find I've got a neighbor who has a wind chime, and that's kind of in that zone. It's a little bit annoying, but again, it's very, you get used to it. So it's a square, and Swainson's thrushes never look like a square. Swainson's thrushes kind of look like an inverted comma. So you can sort of see quite easily that that's a wind chime. I don't need to dwell on it.
That sounds great. And also Carrie put up a link in the chat to a gosh.
Thank you so much for this webinars. Great interview on Fresh Air. Also researcher Scott Wiedensahl.
Oh, there it was, Scott Wiedensahl.
Amazing stories of the billions of migratory birds that journey over our heads every year and how they manage their feats physically and how they're threatened by economic development, climate change. A new book is A World on the Wing. All right. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie. Please go ahead, go to our chat and grab that link because it'll disappear once this webinar disappears. So please grab it. And along with Carrie and everyone else, I want to thank you very much, Mr. Andy Birch, for presenting for us. This was an incredible program. And you opened up a lot of eyes, including mine.
Thank you.
And ears.
And ears.
And I think people may, I post on LA County Birds, so people may have my email. Feel free to email me if and certainly if a few LA County birders want to form a Slack channel or something so that we can help each other, I can certainly set that up. So.
Great. Fantastic. Well, again, thank you very much. Okay, Mark, one more owl joke.
From you?
No, from you.
I don't have an owl joke ready.
Okay, we'll have to save it
for next time.
We'll save it for next time. Again, thank you very much, Andy. We really, really appreciate it. It was a wonderful program.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll see you.
Thank you.
Good night. We'll see you in the trophy room. Good night, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Cheers.